Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof. Today my co-host Leroy Hill and I are joined by the president of Ratio Christi Corey Miller to offer a biblically sound and philosophically robust discussion of Vladimir Lenin's 1917 book, State and Revolution. We show how Lenin applied the philosophy of Marx and Engels to justify the killing of millions and how many, even today, practice Lenin's ideological violence. Before we dive into our analysis of Lenin's book, let me offer some insight into the events that shaped his worldview. The man we know today as Vladimir Lenin was born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov on April 22, 1870 in Simbirsk, Russia. Radicalized in his youth, Vladimir adopted the pseudonym Lenin in 1901 to keep secret his work to overthrow the state. Now I'll get back to that in a minute, but first we need to look at Lenin's childhood. Lenin was one of 6 kids born into a well-educated, financially stable, and close-knit family, but several dramatic events shaped his ultimate embrace of violent revolution. First, at the age of 16, he embraced atheism. Second, the Tsarist Russian government grew fearful of the system of public education which threatened their power. As a countermeasure, many educators were silenced, including Lenin's father, who was threatened with forced retirement from his role as a teacher. He died, however, before the state could make good on that threat. Third, in 1887, Lenin's eldest brother, Alexander, was a student activist at the University of St. Petersburg. Alexander was eventually executed for conspiring with a revolutionary terrorist group that aimed to assassinate Emperor Alexander III. With the death of his father and his eldest brother, Lenin, at the age of 17, became the head of his family. And although they never suffered poverty, Lenin did see his brothers and sisters suffer harassment, imprisonment, and even exile. Despite his family's criminal reputation, Lenin himself was accepted into university where he planned to study the law. Just 3 months in, he was expelled for illegal political activism, arrested, and exiled to his grandfather's estate. It's during this time Lenin was further radicalized, both in his associations and from reading works like Karl Marx's Das Kapital. Despite his exile, Lenin was eventually allowed to take the bar exam, which he passed with the highest scores in 1891. He practiced law for just 1 year, but his experience defending the poor intensified his hatred of the class bias within the legal system and the hypocrisy he saw among the socialist Democrats. In 1895, Lenin traveled abroad and networked with revolutionary Marxists in Europe. In December of 1895, Lenin was swept up by the government along with his comrades and jailed for 15 months. At the end of this period, he was once again exiled, but this time not to his country estate, but to Siberia, where he remained for 3 years and where he eventually married his fiancée. Freed in 1900, Lenin moved to Munich, Germany, and worked to unite his Marxist comrades against the bourgeois capitalists and social democrats whom he saw as the barrier to socialism. His views were summarized well by Britannica Online, which reads as follows, quote, "Even while in exile in Siberia, Lenin had begun research on his investigation of the peasant question, which culminated in his magisterial development of Capitalism in Russia, published legally in 1899. In his work, A Study of Russian Economics, he argued that capitalism was rapidly destroying the peasant commune. The peasantry constituted for the populace a homogeneous social class, but Lenin claimed that the peasantry was in actuality rapidly stratifying into a well-off rural bourgeois, a middling peasantry, and an impoverished rural proletariat and semi-proletariat. In the last group, which comprised half of the peasant population, Lenin found an ally for the extremely small industrial proletariat in Russia." The next major event I'll point out is the overthrow of Russia's Tsar on March 1917. After hearing the news, Lenin immediately left his home in Sweden to return to Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, Russia. Lenin decried the new provisional government as an imperialist dictatorship of the bourgeois and lobbied for a Soviet government directly ruled by the workers, soldiers, and peasants. Lenin believed that a second revolution was necessary. Again, let me read from Britannica. Quote, "Lenin's decision to establish Soviet power derived from his belief that the proletarian revolution must smash the existing state machinery and introduce a dictatorship of the proletariat, that is, direct rule by the armed workers and peasants, which would eventually wither away into a non-coercive, classless, stateless, communist society." He expounded this view most trenchantly in his brochure that we are exploring today, The State and Revolution. The brochure, though never completed and often dismissed as Lenin's most utopian work, nevertheless served as Lenin's doctrinal springboard into power. End quote. So once again, in his mission for revolution, Lenin went into hiding and wrote letters encouraging his Russian Communist Party allies, also known as the Bolsheviks, to take up arms against Russia's provisional government. His activism eventually led to the Bloody November Revolution of 1917, known as the Bolshevik Revolution. Once his party was in power, Lenin came out of hiding and took the reins as leader of the new Soviet state from 1917 to 1924. The success of Lenin's tactical violence shaped what we know today as the communist worldview. Benjamin Weicker offers us some good insight on the importance of this Bolshevik revolution. He writes the following: if the Bolshevik Revolution is, as some people have called it, the most significant political event of the 20th century, then Lenin must, for good or ill, be regarded as the century's most significant political leader, not only in the scholarly circles of the former Soviet Union, but even among many non-communist scholars. He has been regarded as both the greatest revolutionary leader and revolutionary statesman in history, as well as the greatest revolutionary thinker since Marx. So Lenin's communist ideals ushered in one of the most brutal dictatorships in human history. Ironically, the very tactics used by the Tsarist regime against his own family were used by Lenin against his enemies, leading to authoritarian measures like the Red Terror. The Red Terror was a campaign of political repression and violence which defined Lenin's Bolshevik government during the Russian Civil War, which ran from 1918 to 1921. The Red Terror involved mass arrests, executions, and imprisonment without trial, and the violent suppression of all uprisings that dared to speak truth against Lenin's power. The estimates of the deaths range widely from tens of thousands to over 100,000. Lenin's health declined after suffering several strokes in 1922, and eventually he died on January 21st, 1924. Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin, continued the Marxist brutality. Now, as an aside, I had the chance to visit the former Soviet Union before it fell in 1991. I had the chance to visit Moscow, Kiev, and Leningrad, and to some extent see firsthand the devastation of communist oppression visited on the people in the name of liberation. I remember our tour guide Ludmila telling us about the numbers of people killed by Stalin. And she said it wasn't 20 or 40 or 60 million, as some estimate, but she said it was up to 80 million killed in the name of Marxist freedom and revolution. Now, I don't know if her numbers were right, but what I found interesting was that here was our state-authorized tour guide who was willingly pointing out our KGB agents, the people assigned to watch over us, and yet she felt the freedom to speak openly about the atrocities of her own government. So it really didn't come as much a surprise to me that not just a few days after our plane took off, on August 19th, 1991, the tanks rolled down the streets of Moscow into Red Square in what would really be a failed effort to overthrow the evil communist regime. At least failed for the moment until it ultimately succeeded later that winter. So with that background in mind, let me bring in Leroy and Corey to discuss Vladimir Lenin's 1917 book, The State and Revolution. Corey, welcome, my brother. Why don't you introduce yourself, what you do, and then tell us maybe a little bit about why this topic of Lenin, Marxism has been significant to you or important to you in your studies.
Greetings, brother Joe Miller. No relation here, but good to be with you guys on this podcast. So yeah, I am president and CEO of Ratio Christi. We're on 100 college campuses. We have a high school division, a professor's division, and we are international. I did my work first off in pastoral ministry, went on to the university, did PhD work in philosophy. And it's when I was at Purdue University taking a graduate course on Marxism by a distinguished philosopher and some people who have since gone on to author multiple books on Marxism and anarchism. That's when I began to see where all of this stuff was coming from and where it was going. Just to read to you, one of my classmates who used to wear, a trench coat, the knuckled makeup, and then he polished up nicely when he went on the job market. I got a Texas congressman that actually contacted me to do a character assessment on this guy because the attorney general was investigating him for doxing a police chief's wife. But this is what was going on in the classroom. And he wrote this on his Facebook page. I want the entire world to burn until the last cop is strangled with the intestines of the last capitalist, who is strangled in turn with the intestines of the last politician. And he had an Antifa logo on his Facebook profile. Those were my classmates at Purdue University. And I got published from a paper in that classroom, but I was the only person of my ilk in the entire class. And I started to see, wow, this is where this stuff is going. And our ministry, Ratio Christi, became one of the first ministries in the country to put any literature out critical of critical theory because of seeing this move from the campus to the culture. And now we all live on campus today, you might say.
Yeah, that's amazing. Oh, and I should say at this point, full disclosure, I am on staff with Ratio Christi. So Corey is not related to me. Both Millers, not related, but he is president. And so I have to be nice to him no matter what. And so otherwise he'll fire me from my missionary job. So it's probably not true, but I'll be nice to him anyway, because he's a good guy and he's smart. So Leroy, any thoughts, intro before we dive into the content?
Yeah, you know what's fascinating about Lenin, and I don't think we'll get a chance to talk about it much today, but I was trying to think of who his contemporary is, who is someone whose ideas he models, and it wasn't so much his ideas are modeled, but he's completely Machiavellian. I mean, while he doesn't mention Machiavelli at all, it's not a part of his work. If you were to think about, read about, catalog the way that he thinks and displays his ideas and works them through, he's completely Machiavellian, and I think that is the thing that surprised me. I mean, for Lenin, he was willing to to forego the overall pursuit of something if things weren't working, as long as he could go back to it. I mean, he's just a real politique philosopher, and he's completely insane. we don't the interesting thing is we I guess we see men like this on the world stage, but we don't see very many people like him on the world stage today. I mean, and if they are, they're far more cloaked than this guy ever was. I mean, this guy is, wow.
Yeah, he was pretty direct and about his ideas, which is nice. When you get to somebody, sometimes philosophers can hide their true intent and big words and fancy language. But Lenin, dude, you got to respect the dude because he's upfront about what he believed and he did not try to hide it, which is pretty significant. Well, that's actually, your comment, Leroy, is a pretty good transition for us because normally, as folks that are following along, we're doing a worldview analysis of all of these. And go back to Machiavelli that you mentioned, right? We had a whole show on Machiavelli. If people want to understand why Leroy's making that connection, go back, check out our whole show on Machiavelli. But you'll see, we're answering these 6 basic worldview questions, like where did I come from? What's the right thing to do? How will my legacy be judged? What happens when I die? But we've kind of already covered Lenin's worldview through Marx and Engels, which we also did a show on. So folks can go back and kind of get that more worldview analysis. So because we've kind of done that, what we decided today was that we're going to just kind of pick up some of Lenin's big ideas, pick up his main themes or the thrust of his writing. And then we're going to try to explore that and then kind of look more of an application a little bit today, or a lot of where do we really see this playing out in the culture? That's going to be the emphasis today. So less worldview analysis, a little bit more analysis just of the ideas, and then looking at it where we see it in the political and the religious life today. Because I do eventually, by the end, want to get into where some Christians have adapted these Marxist ideas into their theology. And then kind of we'll give some examples and then see where we go from there. So let's kick things off then with, let me give my summary of Lenin's big idea in this book that we're looking at today. And then I want to get feedback from both of you. And when I'm done with this, I'll kick it to you first, Corey, just give you a chance to set up your mind as you hear this. So my summary, my take is that Lenin argued, particularly in this work, that all centralized governments are the product of a class-based society and that's forever trapped in a cycle of irreconcilable class warfare. So only once class distinctions then are abolished through the socialist revolution could the state, as he says, quote unquote, wither away and usher in the socialist ideal. However, to end the rule of this classist distinction, what he calls the sort of the bourgeoisie capitalist control, Lenin believed he really required the embrace of violent revolution. It wasn't optional. This was a mandated piece of that. What he called the dictatorship of the proletariat. That was what he saw as the majority of the people, the peasantry, the people without power, without money. They had to become their own sort of dictatorial leadership. And this was Marx's vision, he said, for winning the battle of democracy. And we'll come back to that word democracy and what that even means and how do we win the battle for democracy, because we hear that a lot today. But he demanded the oppression of the minority capitalists and the landowner class of people until all remnants of class itself could be abolished. That was sort of the ultimate goal. So that's my basic take on what I think he repeats again and again, almost like every chapter is sort of repetitive. It almost repeats the same things with a few other little supporting details. So Corey, again, I'll point it to you. What do you think of that summary? Is it correct? Is it missing? Or is there a part of that you just want to bring out that you think is more significant than others?
Gosh, there is so much there and so much that you can see in contemporary society, whether you're looking at things that are happening in South Africa, whether you're looking at things in America, in Europe, in Germany in particular, right now in the parties. Lenin, he emerged as a revolutionary, part of the leader of the Bolshevik or the majority party, not the Mensheviks. And the Mensheviks were wanting to do it more democratically, more parliamentary, more legal and process. And he was saying, no, revolution is the only way. It is absolutely essential. There is no way we're going to get out of this morass that we've been in since forever, essentially, in this evolution of what will be inevitable in history, this march toward communism. We need to help this out in this process from capitalism to communism by an intermediate state. And that can only happen by violent revolution. And he and Marx not only looked back at, and we'll get into this a bit, at the Paris Commune as kind of an ideal, but they looked back even farther to the original French Revolution. And I don't want to go too far into this right now, but you kind of get the sense in America, are we trying to decide on our own identity whether we support the values behind the American Revolution or the French Revolution? Because Marx was very hip on the French Revolution, and it was vastly different from the American. And I know we'll get into some deep parts on that theologically and so forth, but yeah, this was not in the spirit of Mao. A revolution is not a dinner party, he said. Well, Lenin, at the end of this book, I thought it was noteworthy when he had to take a break from writing because he was kind of busy, and he says, "I have to put off writing for a long time, I guess, to finish this. But as a postscript, it's more pleasant and useful to go through the experience of revolution than to write about it." So, more than an academic, he was an activist. You're on mute, I think, Joe.
Leroy, what are your thoughts on the summary?
Well, it's hard to believe that this person is rational. I think one of the main points that he brings out is the fact that the gentleman is a revolutionary. But what exactly does that mean to be a revolutionary? Well, he wants to overthrow, feudalism. He wants to overthrow, the monarchical rule and put the people in charge, so to speak, right? He says he wants to decentralize power, and give power to the people, in the words of Bain, right? He wants to give power to the people, but really what he does is he just centralizes power in a whole different way. I mean, there's always going to be a ruling class. That's going to be the Bolsheviks. There's always going to be the advance guard who is going to um, make the people spontaneously, overthrow powers at the point or the barrel of a gun. He's going to enshrine feudalism. He's going to do exactly the opposite of what he claims that he's doing, because this is this is something deep and I think fundamental um, in his soul. I mean, this edge toward violence. I think when
Hmm.
Corey talked about the French Revolution, what was the worst thing about the French Revolution is how bloody and how ugly it was. They decapitated all the people who disagree with him. They and this is what he wants to bring about. And I just find everything that he says that he wants to do and that he believes that the people will do to be exactly the opposite of what he actually did. Exactly
Yeah,
the opposite.
I think that's interesting because it gets us to the first point I'm interested in looking at on the idea that revolution has to conquer the state. And that's the first thing that it has to do. But I think one of the things that I see in that is, like in science, we have these theories that come up, or in philosophy, people come up with ideas that are unfalsifiable, like conspiracy
Mhm.
theories, right? Conspiracy theory you can never falsify. So you say, "Oh, John Kennedy was assassinated. It was a CIA conspiracy." What's the evidence? Well, we don't have any evidence. That's the evidence. And so it's sort of like, I think Lenin kind of does the same thing. Like, hey, my goal is to achieve this communist, socialist, stateless, classless reality. Well, the people say, well, look, I'm seeing the evidence that that's the opposite of what you've done. And he
Exactly.
says, well, okay, but that's proof that in my favor, right? That's proof that I'm accomplishing the goal. So the evidence against him is also the evidence for him. And
Right.
so it's kind of like that. That kind of seems to be the way it works. So here's how Lenin describes it. He says there's two institutions in the state that that characterize this bourgeois state, this controlling state. He says the two institutions most characteristic of the state machine, which are the bureaucracy and the standing army. And so the bureaucracy and the standing army, those are the two things that are the levers of oppression. So to overthrow the bourgeois deep state, and I'm kind of using that terminology intentionally here, to overthrow these deep state bourgeois, they have to replace it with a proletariat deep state. And then this is going to undermine the executive power and ultimately then destroy the state. That's sort of the process he outlines. So it's not the destruction of the army and the bureaucracy. It's the co-opting of those things and then making it so unwieldy and so useless that it collapses in on itself. And then that will lead to destruction. That seems to be the strategery behind that idea. So, thoughts on his view of the state and where we might even see that today from you guys. Corey, I'll come again to you first.
Yeah, he equivocates on terms sometimes, so sometimes it's confusing, and we'll get to that, I
Uh-huh.
guess, with language.
Yes.
But when he's referring to the state proper, that is almost invariably to the bourgeois state, the state of the haves versus the have-nots, the oppressors versus the oppressed, the victimizers versus the victims. It doesn't matter what variant, what form the state takes, it is always there to be used to oppress other people, to keep them subdued then by what Gramsci would have called the political society, uh, government, law enforcement, and military, in order to continue to benefit them and keep them up on top. But Lenin has two, I see in this book, two foils. On the one hand, we mentioned the Mensheviks, part of his party, initially the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the more moderates on one end, and then the anarchists on the other end. And he's using them as a foil to try to clarify that his view is really Marxist view. And the anarchists, like my classmate, seem to think that no, there's no secondary state that needs to emerge. We need to smash the state. The state is evil. We need anarchy, no rule whatsoever, because the state is worse than that. We need democracy, governance, people, right? And he's simply saying, no, we actually do. There's this intermediate state, and that is the dictatorship of the proletariat, because we're the victims. We understand what it's like to be victims. We're good people. So we're going to do things right, but we need to use the power that's already there to subdue those who were in power and make sure they don't come back into power. And then we'll set everything right. And then the inevitability will eventually flow. And that state itself is just going to wither away. Unlike the anarchists who want to just demolish it. No, it's going to wither away. It'll just go its own way. Everything's going to be happy.
What's so fascinating about that is all these guys, they say that they're not utopian, right? One of the big things that come out about Lenin is he would claim that he isn't utopian. He's a real politic. He just wants to deal with things as they really are. But these states that they hope to instantiate, these states of affairs, never come to be. What they end up doing is enshrining a ruling class that never leaves. They just replace one form of power, one form of coercion with another form of power and another form of coercion. And then, as you pointed out, Corey, they play language games to confuse people. And if you get too smart and if you make too many arguments, then we're just going to kill you. It's interesting. He said the state is a product of and a manifestation of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms, right? That the state is a product of our antagonism. Well, you know what his solution to that, to the antagonism is, I'm just going to kill you. You're not going to antagonize us. You're not going to say anything against us. We're just going to kill you.
Problem solved.
And yeah, we're just gonna wipe you out. I mean, it is, and he says we're the good guys, right? We're the good guys. We want to put the people in charge, but it's very interesting when you, and I think of this as a person who's been in the military. When you think of, how Russia fights its wars and how they just don't care about people. 500,000, we lose 500,000, and we lose 1 million. We got more. We got more of that to go. This is
Leningrad.
exactly. I'm thinking of, Leningrad. Exactly. That's exactly right. I mean, 1 million. Who cares? This is. I mean, this is just ugly. It really is just ugly. It is passion. It is desire. It is I'm right and everybody else is wrong. And we're going to force you to live this way. I mean, there's nothing is spontaneous about this. There's no spontaneity. There's never going to be a withering away of the state. There's just going to be power at the bottom of it.
Yeah. Well, I think both of you bring up some really good points that help me make sense of our contemporary conflicts that we see between, ostensibly between Republican and Democrat, but really even within those systems. Because you have the anarchist side within the Democratic side, you have the socialist Democrat side, you have the more, existing statist type people. All of them want to use they want to use the bureaucracy, they want to use those things, but for their ends, for their goals. And so you get somebody like Trump that takes over, and all of a sudden he's doing, we talked about this in our episode where we looked at Wesleyan University. Corey, I mentioned that to you in the preview of the show. We talked about this idea that everyone's mad at, Trump is hurting Harvard and he's attacking the freedom of the institutions by removing their funding, which is an ironic definition of freedom where I demand your money. But they don't have any problem that that under Biden, he was going after Christian universities like Grand Canyon University and trying to have a $38 million fine against them for these nonsensical violations of his DOE perceptions of things. So when they're using the levers of power for their side, it's fine. It's only when the levers of power are used against them that it's evil. And this infuriates. I mean, you look at social media, everyone gets infuriated. It's like, hey, you did it to us, we're doing it to you. But you get this tribalist interpretation of which powers are good and bad. And this is what we see in Lenin. This is exactly his point, that he's saying, well, yeah, those powers are bad when you use them, but when I use them, they're good because I have a better end in mind. And that's where, Corey, like you said, he's equivocating on terms. He's changing the meaning based on context. And we see this throughout his whole ideas, or throughout his whole idea, the defund the police, the abolish the ICE, like you mentioned, Leroy, and Corey, in your example earlier. We see that, but what people mean by that might vary depending on what their particular search for power might be. So that's what we're stuck at. Yeah, Corey.
I just thought, that part about Leroy said something about them denying that they're utopic in their vision. I started seeing something in my last read through of State and Revolution where the denial was individual nations utopia, because you still have to have power when you've got other neighbors, other nations. It's almost like there has to be this time, and I don't know how long this is going to last, until 190 different nations get it and they all hit that socialist brink. And they all have a conference together, and then they all decide together that it can just wither away. Because until that happens, you've got this competition, and your single socialist state, which is not yet utopia until you hit the final state of communism, it's never going to happen. As Leroy said, you're going to have this dictatorship of the proletariat there for centuries or millennia. It's just one empire replacing another one, it seems like.
Yeah.
And then the part about the, defunding the police. I mean, gosh, we saw where that was, 5 years ago. People had this ideology and there was a trigger that happened. And suddenly, instead of the Paris Commune in 1871, you have Chop and Chaz in Seattle in 2021, which lasted, about 6 weeks as opposed to the other one, about 10 weeks. But it was an armed guard that took over, and then they started defunding the police at that time across all states, wanting to replace them with the good guys, with counselors, with therapists, as though that was going to happen. But still, you had a certain armament going on. It's crazy.
Yeah. Well,
what's interesting?
Go ahead, Leroy.
I took this class from Joe several years ago, and I think one of the key points that he raised in that class that really just catapulted me in my thinking was when he tied this all back to the reason for the rule of law. The reason for the rule of law is because to be righteous is to be in with the in group, whoever's in political power, and to be their friends is to be righteous, and therefore to be out of power is to be unrighteous. And when we were talking about, I think you mentioned this earlier, Joe, when he said that it didn't matter. I mean, who was in power? They both wanted to use the government for their own means of power. This is the same thing that Plato is addressing, in the Republic. And what it is a walking away from the rule of law. And really, it's an embrace of Lenin's real rule, which is struggle. Lenin's real rule is struggle. And what you just described, Corey, is struggle. And the reason why struggle has to be at the root of it is because there's 192 nations that need to be brought to heal. And if you don't have struggle as the basis of or the animating idea, then your idea will wither and die on the vine. So struggle has to be at the root and the basis of it. Because if you don't, where's the revolutionary energy coming from? right? Where's the revolutionary energy coming from? It's struggle against the man. It's struggle against somebody, because they stand in the way of your utopic vision for what society can be. And this is why, they say one thing and they mean something totally different. It is utopic.
So with that utopic idea in mind, that play, a lot of times it seems like clearly a play on words. Again, they might be equivocating on what is the state or not. We'll keep unpacking that theme. Will come back again. But I sort of wrote this out as a statement, but as a question I want to give to you guys. Does Lenin's revolution, does it really actually seek the end of democracy? Does it really seek the death of democracy? And at one point, I think that's a question. Another point, I think it's a statement. It does. But here's the way he said. Here's what he says. We all know that the political form of the state at that time is the most complete democracy, but it never enters the head of any of the opportunists who shamelessly distort Marxism. That Engels is consequently speaking here of democracy dying down of itself or withering away. This seems very strange at first, but is incomprehensible only to those who have not thought about democracy also being a state and consequently also disappearing when the state disappears. So even Lenin, it seems what he's saying here is, yes, we need the tyranny of the proletariat when they take over, right? It's going to be a collective rule. It won't be a single dictator. It's dictatorship by the group of the formerly oppressed who are now going to oppress the capitalists, the bourgeois, all those sort of people. And that's a democratic rule because it's that collective making decisions. It's sort of a brute, a mob democracy, right? The majority. But he says, but look, even in Engels, he says, look, that eventually still represents the existence of a state because there's still the levers of power that need to be controlled. But until the bureaucracy and the standing army and all those things are done away with, we don't have the socialist utopia, the communist reality that we dream of. So even democracy, he seems to suggest here, has to be eliminated, at least in some definition of it. And this is where I get back to the equivocation of terms. I struggle to understand what he even means by that because he still seems to think that there's a group consensus, but that would be democracy. But he says it's not democracy. And, maybe it gets really, honestly, I think muddled. And I don't know if it's because I'm just not bright enough to understand the brilliance of Lenin or if it's just he's using terms so, in such unique ways that it just makes no sense, ultimately collapses in on itself. So I need your wisdom, gentlemen.
Yeah, taking it charitably that he's sincere in what he's saying as opposed to cynically that he just wants perpetual power for himself and Kim Jong-il and all the other Marxist leaders who refuse to sleep in the same tents as those that they've just liberated. They live in these big, palaces themselves. The demos, the people, and the kratos rule, going all the way back to ancient Greece, he would say, you don't have freedom as long as you have the state. And every state, every variant state is going to be a bourgeois state. It's going to be a ruling class of the minority over the majority. And so this is where he equivocates on it and says, we're going to have to use a democracy but by the good guys, the proletariat, the dictatorship for a time. But then he says on page 80, democracy and its ideal is the abolition of classlessness. That is statelessness. And so that intermediate state is supposed to be temporary. It's a necessary means to the good end. And once the magic happens, and through rule of dictatorship law, with the arms of the good guys, the people, the rules are there for long enough to establish habit, and all of a sudden everyone sees themselves as getting wrong. And it just withers away. If I could, I'd like to read another Lenin, John Lennon, the evangelist John Lennon's famous song.
Yeah.
Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. So get rid of religion. Imagine all the people, the demos, living for today. Aha. Imagine there's no countries, no borders, even that kind of property, no sovereignty. It isn't hard to do, nothing to kill or die for. And reminder, no religion too. Imagine all the demos, the people, living in peace. Yoo-hoo. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us. Here's the altar call, so the world will be as one. And one more time, imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, just the brotherhood of man. Imagine all the demos, the people, sharing all the world. It's like biblical. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. Here's my last gospel open altar call. I hope someday you'll join us so that the world will live as one. That's utopic, but it's got to go beyond borders. It has to be not the 192 nations. Somehow the magic is they're all going to see it at the same time. Revolution will have happened in every single one of them, the intermediate state, in 190 different areas. And then somehow classlessness will just dissolve because they'll all become habituated by the rules of the dictatorship of 190 plus proletariat revolutions.
You know, the only problem with that is there's only one problem. It is
Just one.
it just totally misunderstands human nature.
Boom.
I mean, because if you think about it, it's logically consistent within itself. Lenin's stuff makes sense to Lenin and people who think like Lenin. It's logically consistent within itself, but it just totally misunderstands human nature and gets experiential relevance totally wrong. It wants to force Lenin wants to force people to be as he is. But even if you think about as he is like we said, he'll use the state. He thinks the state is temporary. He thinks democracy is a temporary mask. You know, in that sense, he's willing to utilize it to achieve the ends because for Lenin, the ends justify the means. And whatever I need to do to get to those means, even if it's take a sideways step or a slight step backwards in order to get there, that is totally fine. But for Lenin, it's no wonder that they chose the hammer and the sickle because the people need to be hammered into this view, and it's because
Or cut their heads off.
he thinks that he thinks that people are machines, people are robots, they're automatons. You can train them, you can re-educate them, right? You can re-educate them, and if they won't be re-educated, if they won't be trained, if they won't do what you tell them to do, then 73 million of them under Mao can die. Millions upon millions, and uncountable millions under Stalin can die. And while Lenin isn't as murderous as those two, he's murderous. He's still murderous. He will still murder those who stand in the way of his goals. I mean, those other two are just a logical extension of his ideas. They take his ideas where he hadn't yet thought to take his ideas. I mean, and it's because he just has a very ill-conceived view of people. It's
You know,
just, it's
I took heat this week. You guys might be shocked to find on the internet. I was critical of Pope Leo the 14th because he had sent out this tweet that said, war is never inevitable. And then he got on to say, we can dialogue, whatever, all this sort of stuff. And I don't mind the idea that, okay, war is, everyone got mad because I was saying, that's just not true. They say, oh, you love war. I'm like, no, I'm not saying war is good. I'm not saying it's amazing. I'm saying the idea that the assumption that war is never inevitable assumes something about the nature of humanity that actually flies in the face of Augustinian theology, which he claims, historically as an Augustinian monk. But it denies the just war theory of Roman Catholicism. It's the view, the Christian view is not that war is never, it's never inevitable. The war is it's the exact opposite. War is inevitable because we're sinful and flawed human beings. It would only be it's only going to be ended when Christ returns. Until that time, war is inevitable. But that doesn't mean we don't work for peace or we don't try to limit its power or context. But he had that sort of utopian, and it makes sense since his time in, was it Peru, I guess, is where he spent a lot, decades in ministry. And so you get the liberation theology coming into his background, which is Marxist and its influences. So you see these ideas, these little statements of things that come up, where Lenin writes it in his book, John Lennon writes it in his song, and Pope Leo puts it into a post on X. But it's this sort of utopian idea that doesn't really truly reflect the nature of humanity. But let me jump then to one other, this next issue of private property, because you brought that up in the song, Corey, with Lenin's song, but it's also a big part of Vladimir Lenin's work. He says this about private property, and this I think is really interesting because it's hard to unpack exactly what do people mean by these terms. But he says, he talks about government housing. We could look at universal health care, universal basic income, are all state-run controls that we see people on, say, the progressive side of the aisle advocating for. They want all of these things. But Lenin would argue all of those are still state-run controls that should be abolished. So the question, I guess, what it's hard to figure out is when people advocate for universal basic income, all these, all public housing, the end of rents, and all these sort of things, do they really believe that that is the end goal, or do they believe that that's the interim goal until we can abolish the class of society? Because for Lenin, the idea of private property, he defined that not as an individual's ability to control their own land or live in their own home or make their own decisions about what's on that property. But he uses private property to describe each person's obligation. Is basically the private property is used as a means of production to serve the collective good. So private means you have the obligation to use it to produce something that you are obligated to use for the collective good. But that's a different thing than is meant by, say, the traditional Republican understanding of private property as giving you some autonomy from the state, or even the collective control of others. So here's this idea of private property. Where is he writing about this? Where do we see it? What's actually happening in our conflict over private property today? Thoughts on that from you guys?
It's a good question. I mean, it's private property is to be converted into common property, so that you still will be a worker, but you will be united with your labor. Marx talked about being alienated from our labor in the process of capitalism, having someone as the owner, the ruling class, and me not having the ability to really partake of the fruit of my labor, only the grind of my labor. Now you get rid of privatization and make it all communal, and everybody's got the same stuff. They're supposed to be, once again, as Leroy pointed out, good. The problem is socioeconomic oppression. That's why people get greedy in the first place. That's why we do bad things in the first place. We're not bad people. We're made to be bad people by socioeconomic oppression. And the solution is socioeconomic liberation, or emancipation. So that, again, once again, that freedom, oftentimes we think of freedom, life, liberty, and property, as John Locke used to say. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We think of freedom and we think about property. Lenin says you can't use freedom and the state in the same word. Those are oxymorons. Property ownership in the Communist Manifesto, you can sum up his project as abolish all private property. It needs to be communalized because it's the privatization itself, which is the bastardization of the human good. The human good will only be achievable once we have classlessness. No one owns two pieces or even one piece. We all own it together or not at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking for private property. I think I always thought that he meant the means of production, right? That everybody owns the means of production, but if everybody owns the means of production,
That's true. I agree.
nobody owns the means. Nobody owns the means of production, and really, it's this double talk that we're talking about because the state owns the means of production. This group that is supposed to wither away, and dole out benefits to individuals to make sure that everybody has, what they need. This group that is supposed to wither away and vanish never vanishes.
Mm-hmm.
Once that thing gets enshrined, it is here to stay. I mean, where have we ever seen anything like this work anywhere in the world? And this gets to that point about experiential relevance. It never works anywhere in anybody's experience anywhere. It's antithetical to how people naturally or generally organize themselves in any way. And this is why I just thought this was just him replacing one centralized form of government, feudalism, which was the thing, land owned by the monarchies and the royal and the rich, with another, the advance guard, the party, becomes the power, and the party owns everything, and the party tells you what to do with anything. And when you really look at it, at the bottom line, what's different from the party than the monarchs and the ruling elites, except this: the party is the monarch. They own
Mm-hmm.
the means of production. They own the place where you get benefits from, and you're still left in the same position. The only thing that is different is that the hands have switched. It's switched from the left to the right, or it's from the right to the left, or it doesn't matter. It's just another,
Mm-hmm.
ruling power.
But it's only
Yeah.
temporary. It won't be here for long. As soon as
Yeah.
it's habituated, the people will have nothing and like it.
Yeah. Well, and this is really what you guys both said really actually kind of clicked something for me. This does go connect to our worldview analysis that we've been doing on all these ideas. We have to look at that sort of ontological reality, that what is ultimate true about the existence of what makes us human or what makes us persons. And the Marxist ideal is that the individual doesn't really exist. The collective is what matters, not the individual. When it comes to rights, the rights of the collective are more important, not the rights of the individual. Individual rights are the enemy of the collective. And so when they say private property, they don't mean private as in the individual, they mean private to the collective, independent of the state. But in a Western sort of the Judeo-Christian worldview, when we hear the word private, we think individual. And they trade on this misunderstanding, this different definition based on a worldview assumption of what the word private even means, to persuade people that I mean private, yeah, I care about you, Corey, I care about you, Leroy. But what they really mean is I care about the collective and the rights of the collective. And if that means I have to subvert the rights of the individual, that's fine, because the individual doesn't really even exist in a sort of Darwinian Marxist materialist reality. The human person is irrelevant because they don't even have existence. Yeah, Corey.
And I think this is where one of the applications of what's going on today is the whole notion of individual rights. The new left versus the old left are not the same any more than the Republican and the Democrat were. The neo-Marxists, the progressives, the new left that has infiltrated even majoritarian positions in political parties like the Democratic Party, has forced out some of the political liberals, in the bigger case, political liberalism, but even smaller liberal versus conservative, because Marxism is illiberal. And so you find people now in this new Republican Party that includes the former Democrat Trump, the former Democrat Elon Musk, the former Democrat presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard, the former Democratic presidential candidate and a Kennedy, RFK, and then, other people that are making that shift too, because they've realized that the ground underneath them has begun to shift. This is a foreign ideology that has infiltrated not only academia and media, but the political class as well. And people are feeling this. It is antithetical to individual rights. It is about the collective. So you're right on there. And the utilitarian ethic is that the end justifies the means, the greatest good for the greatest number.
Yeah. So again, all these ideas flow within Lenin's worldview thinking, and they connect. Untangling them is so hard, in part though, because the revolution has to destroy the meaning and the universality of language. Not just that language doesn't have meaning, but that meaning, even if you give it meaning, it's never universal. Just like there's no meta-narrative, right? The Marxist worldview denies any sort of overarching narrative that binds all things together. There's no such thing as a universal right. There's no such thing as a universal state or reality. Even class itself, none of those are universals or eternal. They're all social constructs, inventions. And language is the same thing. And they trade on this to get their ideas across. This is Orwell's 1984, right? The changing of language, the change of meaning. And they do this to destabilize, to make people think, well, you thought you knew something, but really you didn't know that thing. We see that in art movements, like the Dadaist art movement out of France, where they would, take a urinal and flip it on its side and call it the fountain. And everybody looking at it knows it's a urinal. It's for, a men's bathroom. But by renaming it fountain, you're saying that word we think means something doesn't describe anything in reality. We are disassociating language from what is real, because language is itself, there is no external reality. There's only the state. There's only the reality of what culture has produced. And so it's a completely different project. But the renaming part, this is where I want to focus in on, because we see this so much today. So Lenin writes this: authority, this is in chapter 4, he says, authority and autonomy are relative terms, that the sphere of their application varies with various phases of social development, that it is absurd to take them as absolutes. So the idea of authority, autonomy, private, all this language is relative language, relative to who's in power, relative to what the conditions are politically at the moment. We see this in the sort of neo-Marxist movements, the Frankfurt School, the idea of tolerance. Well, tolerance is only a word that goes one direction. It's only a word that is necessary to use until the oppressed gain power, then they will no longer be tolerant. We see this in the renaming of everything. It's interesting, the story for Lenin himself, and I think this goes to his family life a little bit too. His brother goes to university and is a part of the group of people that are revolutionary in their thinking. He's at St. Petersburg, right? The city of St. Petersburg, St. Petersburg University, named after Peter of the Apostle, St. Peter. This is the religious history there. But when the first revolution comes, and then eventually the second revolution, all of these, St. Petersburg gets named Petrograd, then from Petrograd to Leningrad. Every time a new revolution comes, they rename all the institutions. And, I bring up Lenin's brother because in some sense there was this sort of satisfaction. Here's his brother who is eventually imprisoned, and he's got, all of his family gets imprisoned and they get killed. His brother gets killed by the state for his revolutionary things. But now these things get to be renamed, right? It's no longer these old institutions, and the renaming of that happens as a key. Matter of fact, it was funny because when I in 1991, I got to visit the Soviet Union. Was still the Soviet Union. We actually were there. Within about a week, we had left, I think within 5 days of the first, the revolution that eventually failed, the August revolution, the tanks were rolling down the streets of Red Square, and then it failed like 5 days later. But we missed it by like 5 days. We would have been there for it. It'd have been pretty cool to be there. But I'm walking and here's Lenin's tomb, and here's all these statues of Lenin. We're in Leningrad. I've got a Hard Rock Cafe Leningrad shirt, But then a few months later, oh, it's St. Petersburg again, and it's all those things get renamed. And I think we see that not just as a part of the project of communists to achieve communist utopia. We see that today in the tearing down of statues and the renaming of everything has to get renamed, and the equivocation on language that doesn't mean anything objectively. It's all relative to some goal or some end. Your thoughts on that use of language and how you see it playing out today?
I mean, the interesting thing is Marxism emerged during the scientific revolution, during modernity, not post-modernity. But post-modernity, which resists meta-narratives and even human nature, individual rights, things like that, it's skeptical as opposed to scientific, even though Marx himself started out scientific in his thinking. But the neo-Marxists and their postmodern elements, you have the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory taking place in the 1920s. They had to get out of town in 1933 when another group of socialists, the Nazis, the National Socialists, rose to power. The globalist socialists who don't like borders had to get out of there. And they came to America. But within a decade or two, some others started to appear in France. They're the fathers of postmodernism, like Derrida, Lyotard, and Foucault, who you would think if they're postmoderns and they disagree with meta-narratives, they would be along the political spectrum, left to right. But they're all hard leftists, hard new left, because they were all likewise members of the French Communist Party. So I have this little quote from Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility, right? So we think of her in the last 5 years, but her probably more important book is Everyone Really Equal? The French Revolution talked about equality. Here within the utopic community, we're talking about equality. Is Everyone Really Equal? An Introduction to Key Concepts in Social Justice Education. And she says language is not a neutral transmitter of universal, objective, or fixed reality. Rather, language is the way we construct reality. We construct what it means to be a woman. Knowledge is a social construction of reality. And the way that we first do that is we change the social consciousness through the education system. And that's why you end up getting, people going after the universities in the West and the K through 12 programs to start educating them at a very, very early age. I think about the pedagogy of the oppressed, Paulo Freire, who was in with Cone in American Black liberation theology. He wrote the foreword to his book even, and he had influence, I think, on Pope Francis as well. Incredible.
Yeah. Leroy.
Yeah, it is a Lenin believed that if you change the way the meaning of words, you could change the way that people think. And just take the whole concept of race. I grew up thinking race was, the classic Ku Klux Klan burning the cross, on your lawn, blacks and whites hating each other. That's racism. And it wasn't until I was watching a television program where two black people were going at it. The older black guy had the traditional view of racism. The younger black guy was talking about race in a way in which I had never even thought about. And I thought, as I began to listen to it over and over again, I understood that what he was talking about was that the fundamental nature of the way we construe reality is racist. The way we use time, the way we use logic, the way we talk about the family, the way we talk about law. For him, the fundamental way in which we discuss these things were construed as racist. And what he was doing with the concept of race was saying that whites had fashioned reality around their own identity And in so doing, they were racist. That's where the racism really lied. And this way they could now argue that if you talk about being on time somewhere, or if you talk about hard work, or you talk about delayed gratification, or you talk about, the nuclear family, or
Hmm.
any ways in which we construed what we thought normal, these were all, in his view, racist and intentional. Now, he never really gave us um, what he viewed as normal, but what he was very good at, and I think this is what Lenin's whole point it's acting as a universal solvent, or solvent to wipe away our construction and the social construction of reality, and then and to replace it with what? It is not going to replace it with anything, because the whole point of it is to wipe away democracy and to cause it to wither away and vanish. They're not
Hmm.
going to replace it with anything. They're not going to put anything in instead. They're just going to create the conditions for struggle.
Mm.
That is it.
Yeah.
That is it.
You know, that wiping away that you talk about bridges us to our last issue that I want us to explore for Lenin's ideas. Because as you can't subvert the language, and you can't wipe away democracy. You can't achieve all these goals if religion is in the way. Back to the John Lennon song that Corey brought up earlier, right? You have to imagine a religionless world for all of these other utopic realities to take place. So revolution first must co-opt the religion, and then it can destroy. It's just like the levers of government, right? You're not anarchist. You don't get rid of it. You co-opt it, then you turn it to your end, and then it can wither away. And the same is true for religion. It had to be co-opted. It had to be the opiate of the people to keep the masses in control. But then once you had them in the right place and you co-opted the levers of power, then then religion itself could also, I think, he doesn't use that word wither away about religion, but I'm just sort of taking that analogous idea there. Here's what Lenin quotes Marx in his work, and here's what Marx actually says, as quoted by Lenin. Having once got rid of the standing army and the police, the instruments of physical force of the old government, the commune proceeded at once to break the instrument of spiritual suppression, the power of the priests. And again, this is exactly what you're talking about. Everything you have to use language like the idea of a nuclear family is racist and white supremacist, because this enables you to destroy the power of religion, to say, hey, there's a purpose for family, or there's some value in that, right? But so that's the goal. And so what I want us to explore just for a few minutes, just knowing that's the goal, we can talk about that too, but I want to look at two examples of where I see this. The first is in Karl Barth, and then the second is in Reinhold Niebuhr. And see how they, as Protestant Christian thinkers, co-opted these Marxist ideas, even though they would distance themselves. Barth early in life would have been a communist aligned guy. Later, he sort of said, I'm not so much. Niebuhr never considered himself a Marxist, but they still traded in these ideologies, and then put a veneer of Jesus on them to some degree. But here's what Barth said. Karl Barth says this. In 1911, he wrote a piece called Jesus Christ and the Movement for Social Justice, like Lenin, or Social Justice. Okay, that's the name. So in it, he's like Lenin. Here's what he wrote. He wanted to distance himself from the movement. Interestingly, he specifically mentions Socialist Democratic Party as in a negative light, which Lenin does in this work. And I never actually made the connection much until I was reading Lenin for this. I'm like, oh, that's right. I mean, this is why it bothered him so much too, at least in those early days. But Barth argued that just like we can associate Jesus with the Reformation, we can connect him with the socialism. Here's what he says specifically, quote, Jesus is the movement for social justice, and the movement for social justice is Jesus in the present. So in this way, Barth argued that even those, this is my summary now, even those who do not share the Christian worldview, such as the atheist, the materialist, the Darwinist, the Marxist, he lists all those people, even though they are not Christian in their worldview, they can still be genuine followers of Jesus in their pursuit of social justice. So that was his argument in 1911. And my question is then for either of you, whoever wants to jump in first, where do we see that today? Do we see that at all in evangelical Christianity? Do we see that movement to, hey, we're all following Jesus, even though we don't have the worldview or the theology right? And where do we have these? The ideology is still Jesus is socialism. Socialism is Jesus.
Can I jump on that first?
Mm-hmm.
Hit it.
Remember when we had, I won't say the guy's name, but we went to Grand Canyon University a couple of years ago, and a particular speaker was,
Yeah.
and his last talk of the day was being a bold advocate for critical theory.
Oh, this is in that
And
Evangelical Theological Society meeting?
yeah, he
Yeah,
was
okay.
being a bold advocate for critical theory. He was using words to hide what he was saying. He was speaking to a largely Christian audience whose ears would be attuned to certain ideas, but he was warping those ideas in a way that made them seem Christian. I think Stephen Wolfe and his Christian nationalism is doing
Mm.
the exact same thing, while he has an open religious appeal in his text. Ethically, ecclesiologically, um, uh, I want to say, just from a biblical worldview mindset, he is walking thoroughly away from those ideas and embracing ideas that we would think are antithetical to Christianity, like
Mm.
ethnic homogeneity or cultural homogeneity, those sorts of things. What these guys are doing, like Niebuhr and what Barth are doing, is they are wed to a certain set of ideas. They are wed to these ideas. And what they're attempting to do is Christianize these ideas by stripping away the blunt instrumental object nature of them, and trying to smooth it out in the language, so that people will adopt these ideas and ultimately think that they are decidedly biblical. And it's what makes it very hard for the average person to discern what's going on, to kind of think through what these guys are arguing. And it is destructive to the language, right? It is completely destructive to a biblical worldview, completely destructive to it. But that's part of the goal. I think that's part of the goal.
Mm.
It is because their ideas are not rooted in making, discipling the world and making the world more Christ-like, so to speak. Their ideas are rooted in reconstructing, instead of deconstructing, reconstructing the world, and what they would feel is a more equitable and more fair way of reconstruing it. But what's equitable and what's fair is their view of it, not um, not in lockstep with what the scriptures would say. I think that's just a muddled way of saying they are just using the gospel in order to bring their ideas to fruition, or things they think are right or fair into fruition.
I'm thinking of, I think, Stephen Carter from Yale, his book God's Name in Vain. As I've recently been reassessing that whole notion, what it means to take the Lord's name in vain. It's not saying it as a cuss word, even though doing that is degenerate. But there was no cuss word called God, and the Israelites never used Yahweh as a cuss word. What they did is they baptized their actions in the name of God. And yeah, Lenin himself said, with regard to the Jewish question, the only way that the Jew is ever going, and Lenin had Jewish background, by the way, as did Marx. They were bad species of Jewish people, unlike Jesus. But the only way that the Jew is ever going to be alienated or liberated, rather, is when he is liberated from his Judaism. So another guy who practiced the struggle was the guy who wrote the book Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And if you've ever been to one of the concentration camps by these National Socialists in Germany, when I was there, the sign in front of the camp said, "Work makes free."
Mm.
And the idea for these Jews, they're going to be free. In fact, it's after they're worked to death. At the time of the socialist revolution for the nationalists as opposed to the globalists, the church then was busy baptizing the babies and wrapping them in swastikas. You might replace that with the hammer and sickle, and you might replace it with Black liberation theology or social justice theology in our seminaries and Christian academic societies and campus ministries today, who have allowed themselves to be co-opted by grievances rather than the gospel, or even it's yet to be seen what the current pope's view is. But the previous pope, I mean, he created the movement that was called dialogue, which was a transversal dialogue between the leftist European Christians and Marxists explicitly, with the common goals together. And he said, in search of a common future in solidarity, only together can we be saved. And you find this stuff everywhere, the co-opting of Jesus for their own ends.
Yeah. Yeah. And Leroy, I'll let everyone know, Leroy's been doing a little series. He started part 1 on Christian nationalism, looking at Wolf's stuff. I'm going to link to that in the show notes so that, and I sent that along to Corey, by the way, to Leroy, and he thought it was a good article. So I'll link to that in the show notes. The show notes on the Substack. You can find it at morethancake.org, and that will be there as well for if folks want to find that. You know, it's interesting tying some of this together to, again, another show that we did on Nietzsche. Nietzsche, he ushered in sort of the death of morality, right? And Lenin ushers in the death of the state. But what I see, I think, is a lot of Christians, from my perspective, like to put these two ideas in the mind of God, as if these are both the biblical idea, the death of morality, the death of the state. We mush them all together, and then we can just make this the project of the Bible. And I think I see that in specifically the Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. Now, that's for folks that maybe know the name Niebuhr. Richard Niebuhr was his brother, who did I think it was the 5 views on culture and or Jesus and culture. Right. That was Richard Niebuhr. Reinhold is his brother. Reinhold, most people will know him as the author of the Serenity Prayer. The God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. That is Reinhold Niebuhr. So we all quote him in our Serenity Prayer. But he's actually the insane brother of Richard. Reinhold is the nutty one. He writes a book in 1932. So we had Barth in 1911, and now we go to Reinhold Niebuhr in 1932. Again, a lot of this German influence, a lot of the influence from the Frankfurt School type thinking. It's this neo-Marxist mentality that invades their Christian view. But he writes this book in 1932 titled Moral Man and Immoral Society. This is Leroy, when he was in my ethics class almost a decade ago. I've used this quote forever. This is a fabulously amazing book. Like Lenin's is so direct about what he thinks, Niebuhr was very direct. And it's so helpful because he cuts through the philosophical language and he's just straight out telling you what he thinks. Here's what he says in his book. He says, quote, "The middle classes and the rational moralists," by that he means Christians consumed by rationalism, who have a natural abhorrence of violence, may be right in their general thesis of transcendent human moral worth. Right? That's what he's arguing. So this Christianity has this idea that every human is made B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God, has intrinsic moral value. So he said maybe in some way those people are right. He says, but they are wrong in their assumption that violence is intrinsically immoral. Nothing is intrinsically immoral except ill will, and nothing intrinsically good except goodwill. So his whole point is that, yes, it might be wrong for me to attack and kill somebody like Leroy or you, Corey, and the immoral as a man. But as society, we can accomplish these things by killing off the people who keep us from understanding our collectivist goals, our utopian goals, justify the killing of the individual. So, the moral society can do these things. And to say that it's violent or wrong to kill somebody for these political purposes is just the manipulation of religion. It's a tool of religion to keep the oppressed oppressed. Right? You're telling me I can't kill my enemy to overcome their oppression because they are made in the image of God, yet you oppress me. And so the only way through this is to justify the killing of the enemy. And this is what Lenin's whole project was. And it's what somebody like Reinhold Niebuhr eventually advocates in his book. And he's saying this is the real Christian virtue. This is the real Christian thing to do, is to allow for violence against one's political enemies so we can achieve this, what we're going to call here the utopian ideal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so utopian that somebody's got to die. I can't live in this world unless this person is out of that world. And that's just a very, his idea is perverse because, again, he's cut out the possibility of God working on his behalf. The idea of God um, utilizing the struggle or slavery or some deleterious situation for his purposes and your benefit, and working it out in the end is done away with. What needs to be dealt with right now is the immediate threat that I'm under the thumb or under the power of this individual. And if that means killing them, that means wiping them out, then it's justified. You just hope that you're not your good isn't perceived as oppressive by someone, because then they have justification to kill you on his view. I mean, it means that any act is always subject to the subjective whims of the individual committing those acts. It's you know these people just don't have a grip on reason. I'm sorry, they just don't have a grip on reason.
Well, I think about another Jewish atheist who is utilitarian, Peter Singer, the avant terrible maybe of moral philosophy, the most famous or infamous among moral philosophers. Again, he was Jewish. He's an atheist, but he is a utilitarian ethicist. The end justifies the means. You cannot classify something as evil or good unless and until you know the consequences. Intent doesn't even matter. It is just the consequences. That's all that matters. And it was the French who coined the expression, you cannot get an omelet without breaking eggs. And so, to get rid of all layers of oppression now, in Lenin's day and in Marx's day, it was all about economic. But even before then, Marx talked about economic criticism was tertiary. Political criticism was secondary. Primary was religious criticism. That is the number one thing that needs to be gone after and to revolt against and to undermine and even to co-opt for your gain. So whether it's race, class, sex, gender, ethnicity, or now religion is the ultimate one, family too. A recent book that I read, Abolish the Family, a manifesto for care and liberation, by a Marxist female professor at University of Pennsylvania. It's not just abolish private property, but abolish whiteness, abolish heteronormativity, abolish anything in any class that has a hierarchy that goes beyond my view of equality.
Wow. I'll link. I'm making a note here, and if I can't find it, I will link to that book as well in the show notes, Corey. So I'll put that up so if folks want to take a look at that and get it from your library, so you don't give her any money, because she's an anti-capitalist anyway, so she doesn't want your money. But anyway, so just find it in the library. But yeah, I'm so frustrated at the Christians who follow in these footsteps, because I think to embrace these Marxist ideals, and again, we've talked about it before, we did Marx and Engels, they do diagnose problems that are real within the culture. Their diagnosis is often correct. of where they see something that Christians could agree that would be unjust or wrong. But their prognosis, the way of solving the problem, is completely antithetical to the Christian worldview, to biblical Christianity, to the moral standards that God has set forth. And so what I want to wrap up then with is this. Ask each of you kind of our big takeaway question is, where do you see this? So for the average Christian who sits through this and listens to this, and they're going to be talking to family and friends, or they're in a school, or they've got kids, or whatever it is, they're not going to be necessarily talking to people who have thought deeply as we are about these ideas, or even maybe the culture itself, but they are trying to untangle Christians from these ideas. So where is the opportunity for the gospel in this? When we hear these ideas, when we hear people saying certain things as political statements, how can we create an inroad to the gospel through this understanding, right? So this knowledge is great, but how does it open us? How does it open a door for us to engage people with the good news of Jesus Christ? So, Leroy, I'll have you go first. Corey, our guest, I'll let him go last this time.
Well, I think we have to embrace a thoroughly biblical worldview. Um, Lenin wants us to embrace a God of coercion and class, destruction, struggle, or we can embrace a God who redeems both the so-called oppressor and the so-called oppressed. I mean, we have to choose. I think the inroad to the gospel is for the individual Christian. First, you have to choose which God you're serving: the God of Scripture, the one who redeems both the oppressor and oppressed, the one who the only if there's a consequentialist ethic. I mean, if such a thing can be said, his ideas, his truth, his will is ultimately what will be done. I think we need to embrace those things, and then that gives us foundation. It gives us reason. It gives us license to then begin to talk to our neighbors about their worldview and then how they might walk away from this, dead end struggle. Or should I say this death struggle? You know what I'm saying? Which we're all headed toward. So I think that's where I would say for the individual Christian first, and then out to the rest of the world.
Hmm. Yeah. Inequality does not entail injustice, as we're hearing so much today that it does. Injustice presupposes the reality that there is justice. Where does that come from? The whole issue of a pursuit of equality in the French Revolution or among neo-Marxist or postmodern thinkers. Where does equality come from? As what's his name, Tom Holland. Where does this notion of equality come from? It doesn't come from the Enlightenment. It doesn't come from the Declaration of Independence. It doesn't come from any government. It comes from the Bible, and it comes from God creating man in his image. We have equality in virtue of being created in God's image, and mistreatment of other humans presupposes that there is a proper way to treat them, a way that goes beyond the jungle. And that again comes from God and his revelation, not revolution. If we want revolution, the kind of revolution that Jesus brought on the world and literally transformed the world and gave us a vision that can't be had by Marx. When naturalism took over in the West, Darwin gave us a perspective about our past. Marx gave us a vision or a teleology, a purpose for the future, and only one that requires death and destruction and chaos and carnage along the way. Marx was a bad Jew. Jesus is the one to follow.
Yeah. Yeah, you hit on the nail that I was going to hammer in a little bit too. The key, I think, for Christians is that everything we do in our politics, in our social activism, whatever you want to call it, has got to center the sacredness of individual life all humans are sacred, created B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God, and anything that subverts or privileges the destruction of some people over others because we don't recognize that they have intrinsic moral value and worth, that is a bad thing. And I think where we have to take a stand is we have to be willing to say that this means that I am not going to be the friend of any political party or any political partisan per se. Like there's always going to be something I may need to stand against, even though I would not. Well, I don't think I need to parallel Republicans and Democrats. I think they're very distinct in their current iterations. But that doesn't mean every policy is going to be a policy that aligns with my worldview. And I don't have to defend every action of every politician, especially when it violates some biblical value for the life of the person. So like, for example, Trump's sort of centering in vitro fertilization, right? He's going to, he wants to advance this. This is great. Well, I as a Christian, I think there's some problems. It may depend on what we mean by that and how because there's different medical processes I'm not going to get into, but there's different ways to handle that doesn't necessarily entail the destruction of potentially dozens of embryos every time one is successfully implanted. There might be some technological ways around that, but it doesn't matter, and my saying, okay, I can't support that, or I can't support Trump in that doesn't mean, we don't want to tribalize ourselves. Oh, you're the enemy now because, we cannot tribalize ourselves in that way. And so we have to be very careful because I think we have a lot of our language that we use, a lot of our unwillingness to admit wrong in people that are on our side ostensibly is leading to a lot of Christians down a wrong path. And so if we're going to value the value of every individual, we've got to make sure we're willing to take a political stand, even when it maybe puts us with odds that other people we might be 98% aligned with. That's great, but we still got to stand up for those 2% of times when we know it's wrong. So, okay, that's my end of thought for this show. Guys, I appreciate both of you being here. Corey, thanks for guesting with us and bringing your wisdom and insight and expertise on this issue. Leroy, as always, glad you made it work with your travel schedule, driving your wife around and sitting in your car to do this. Appreciate it so very much, and thank you for your time.
There is so much more that we could say about Lenin's philosophy and revolutionary tactics, but for now I want to encourage my brothers and sisters to go out and till the soil of culture so that we can raise the roof on the death of the state by exposing your friends and family to the enduring power and rule of our King Jesus. I hope you'll come back and join me in the next episode. In the meantime, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org.